Trade shows and franchise shows can be a great way of selling franchises. But a lot of times when I talk to people about trade shows and franchise shows, their first reaction is they have a look on their face like, that's not for me. That's not something that I'm going to do. And I think that a lot of people, when they think about trade shows and they think about franchise shows, they think about the carnivals that they used to go to when they were kids with the barker who would be yelling out to them and trying to get them to try and shoot basketballs through a too small hoop to win a stuffed animal. And that's really not what it's all about when you go to these trade shows and these franchise shows. They can be a good source of leads. They're not right for everybody. It's important to understand, though, that these are warm zone opportunities. And by that we mean that you're going to get a fairly good close rate from typical trade shows or franchise shows, depending on the nature of your opportunity that you're trying to sell. Of course, trade shows are not going to be a primary strategy for anybody. 70% of leads these days are going to come from the internet. So it's important to understand, first of all, are trade shows right for you? Are trade shows right for your audience? On average, when you go to a trade show, you might get 1 or 2 franchise sales out of that show. That's normally considered a good show. You're not going to go to a trade show and get 20 sales. But it can be a good way of supplementing. It can be a good way of geographically targeting, because trade shows oftentimes are going to be geographically specific. So the first question, and I guess in making a decision about trade shows and franchise shows, is to start by understanding that there's a difference between a trade show and a franchise show. Let's talk about a franchise show to begin with. In a franchise show environment, your prospects are actively shopping to buy a franchise. They may not actually be buyers, they may be tire kickers, but they're there looking because they want one thing, and that is to buy a franchise. The biggest franchise shows are the IFE shows, and those are really the only ones that we recommend. Some of the other shows that are out there, what we found is that they tend to cater more to business opportunities. They tend to be a little bit lower level in terms of the attendees and in terms of the exhibitors, and are not necessarily a good use of your advertising dollars. Some of our clients have tried some of these other shows and have said they like them, but for the most part, what we found is that they're not particularly effective. We do, however, recommend the IFE to certain of our clients. Now, there are 3 IFE shows, 3 of the big IFE shows, plus they're starting to introduce some regional shows now. And we've got mostly feedback today just on the larger shows. Not many of our clients have started going to the small regional shows yet. The 3 big shows, the oldest and the biggest is the spring show in Washington, D.C. That's been going on for 20 years plus. There are also 2 additional shows. There's the fall show that's out in Los Angeles, and there is the winter show, which is now being held. It's the newest of the 3 that's being held in Miami Beach in January typically. Those 3 shows are the ones that are sort of had the most proven track record. Give you an idea for scale, these are not huge shows. The IFE in DC, which is the largest and the best attended, has about 14,000 attendees, or at least they did at the last show. And of those 14,000, 90% of them indicated that they are buyers. They've come there with the idea that they want to buy a franchise. And of those, also about 45% said that they had more than $100,000 to invest. So it's a pretty decent sized pool of companies or individuals who are thinking about franchising. Now, when we talk about an industry show or a trade show, there's no focus specifically on franchising. They may have a franchise section. So for example, the NRA, the National Restaurant Association show, which is one of the really big shows out there, they don't have 14,000 attendees. They've got 70,000 attendees. And in some years past, they've had as many as 100,000 attendees. So this is a hugely attended show. And of those 70 to 100,000 attendees, 3,500 roughly said that they were interested in buying a franchise. So the NRA created a franchise pavilion. It's just a small area where they had probably 50 to 75 exhibitors. Now, that's out of a field of 2,000 plus exhibitors. So they've got the one little area that's geared toward franchising. Now, the difference between an industry show and a franchise show is that, first of all, there are going to be fewer franchisors in attendance. And because there's going to be fewer franchisors in attendance, it sort of changes the dynamic. You're going to also have, of course, a highly targeted audience. The audience is not necessarily somebody looking to buy a franchise, but there's somebody who will have industry-specific knowledge. So if you are in the restaurant industry and you're looking for a restaurateur to be your franchisee, this may be a good place for you to go. If you are in the hardware industry, you may want to go to the hardware show. But bear in mind, a small number of the people who are at that show are actually looking for a franchise. So when you're talking about how to work a franchise show, it's different than how you work an industry show. A franchise show typically is going to be largely a local or regional audience. People aren't going to come from Colorado to go to the IFE South in Miami unless they're looking to go on vacation in South Beach. The key here then is going to be to use these for a regional heavy up strategy. So if you're looking to go into the Miami market or into the South Florida market, this might be a great opportunity for you because most people are driving to that show. The exception out of the franchise shows might be Washington, D.C., which does get a pretty large international crowd. So there is a fairly significant international component there. Frankly, we don't usually recommend the trade shows as a means of going after sort of the international crowd, but some people have had some success in those shows. Typically, the franchise shows are held over the weekend. So for most of us, what that means is, people are taking a day off and they're coming in on their Saturday, their Sunday to go and take a look at your franchise opportunity. That being said, you might want to consider staying on an extra day and holding some shows on Monday after the crowds have died down. While you're at the show, you're there for lead generation. You don't want to be having meetings or having seminars or conducting anything else while you're there if you don't have to, because you want to just try and get as many leads as you can and to work your booth. The other thing to remember on these franchise shows is you don't want to invite your prospects. If somebody is already your prospect, you've already identified them, a franchise show is a bad place to meet with them because what they're going to do is they're going to see a lot of your direct competitors. So if you bring them to the show, they're going to see your competitors, and it's going to be more likely that they're going to think about going with somebody else. So typically those meetings might be scheduled the day following that show rather than at the show. Now, a trade show is going to be different. Oftentimes trade shows are going to generate a regional, national, or even international audience. And so sort of the opposite effect is here. They may not necessarily provide as good an opportunity for a local heavy up strategy because of the fact that they're not going to have as high a proportion of local as a franchise show. Now, they still are going to have a better draw locally than they're going to have otherwise. Don't get me wrong on that. But they may have a larger audience outside. So it does provide you with a different kind of dynamic. Likewise, it's a very highly targeted individual. So they're going to have certain skill sets that you might be looking for. The fact of the matter is, though, that at these industry shows, typical industry shows are much bigger than the franchise shows. It's easier to get lost, especially if there's not a franchise pavilion. At the NRA, I mentioned there's 2,000 exhibitors there. Well, at the NRA, if you take a look at just sort of walking through the NRA, it takes up the entire McCormick Place, which is a huge hall for those of you who don't know it. It's on 3 floors. You can literally spend 3 days walking the show without having seen every booth. It's immense, and it takes a long time and a lot of effort to try and do that. And typically also these trade shows or industry shows are held during the week. People are coming in there. It's part of their job oftentimes to come in there. They come in for 2-3 days, and they want to get out of there right away. They want to be back in time for the weekend. They don't want to stick around and spend their weekend in some city in which they're not in because they've flown into this marketplace. So because of that, if you're going to hold seminars, you want to hold the seminars at a trade show during the week, during the time that you're exhibiting. It's sometimes okay to invite your competitor, your prospects, to a trade show. And That's because it's oftentimes likely that your competitor may not be there. If you're in doubt, you can always get an advance registration list from the show sponsors, and they'll tell you who's going to be there and who's not. You can look to see if your primary competitors are there, and if they're not, then you can use your time while you're there to invite people to that seminar or to whatever other event that you might be holding. Now again, both trade shows and franchise shows are not right for everyone. You want to take a look at certain different kinds of characteristics of your franchisees before making a decision as to whether or not that's going to be something you're going to do. For example, financially. Oftentimes what we'll find is that the people with the most money typically don't attend trade shows. It tends to be better for companies that have lower levels of investment than higher levels of investment. That being said, you take a look at the IFE, 12% of the people who go to the IFE report that they have over $500,000 to invest, and 6% represent to the IFE that they have over $1 million to invest. So if 14,000 people attend, that would mean that you'd have the opportunity to be in front of 750 people who might have $1 million to invest. So the question is, what is it worth to you? Is it worth it to be in front of that many people and to be able to show your opportunity to that many people? And that's a judgment call that you're going to have to make based on some of those other characteristics. Second is, who's your target? Are you looking for somebody who's highly targeted? Third is going to be geography. In making the decision, you have to take into account where this show is being held and what geography it's in and whether or not you want to be in that particular geography. And last is cost. What you want to do is you want to figure out what your total cost of getting into that show is. Don't forget to take into account the cost of traveling to the show, the cost of paying for your people at the show, the cost of all the incidentals like the phone and the scanning machine and some of the other things that they'll charge you for at the show, the cost of meals, the cost of hotels. So the show cost typically is, you can oftentimes add $5,000 to the cost of the show just in sending a couple of people to that show to attend that show. So a $5,000 10 by 10 booth is probably really a $10,000 investment. So bear in mind those costs, but then use those costs to calculate a cost per exposure. What you want to do is figure out who is my targeted audience and how many of them are going to be at that show. And if you are looking for $1 million investments and 6% of the people who are going to attend that show and are going to have $1 million to invest, and there's 14,000 people, you say, is it worth $10,000 to get exposed? Well, you calculate a cost per exposure. You divide the $10,000 you're going to spend by the 750 to get your you would see, and then that's your cost per exposure. And it's just like an ad cost, and so you're going to take a look at it from that perspective. And of course, you're going to want to track individual show performance. After you've gone to one of these shows, bear in mind, it may not be something that you're going to be able to put your finger on until you've done this for a year or 6 months down the line. You're not going to get closures that fast. The closures are going to come a little bit more slowly. But you want to track all these costs. You want to get a good understanding. The way you get these things, by the way, talk to the show organizers. They will provide you with a media kit that's going to talk about who attends their shows, what the show looked like the last time, and they should be able to break out most of these kinds of things. And talk to other people who've exhibited in the past. And if franchise shows are something that's in your future and you find that you are getting something on a regular basis out of those shows, then you might end up finding that there's other benefits as well to attending some of these shows in terms of some of the industry education you get and some of the opportunity to hobnob and to network with some of your colleagues. So it's oftentimes these shows are worth going to one way or the other. Make your decision independently as to whether or not they're right for you. Make it based on making an informed decision and understand the differences between working a trade show and a franchise show, and that should help you to be more effective in your franchise sales and marketing process.